The exposure triangle is a graphical way of representing how aperture, shutter speed and ISO interact with each other to give you a good exposure. When you change one of these three principal settings, you have to change either or both of the others to keep that good exposure. Now the triangle isn't like a traditional graph where you can plot on it to get a good exposure. Instead, it just shows that these three principal settings are interrelated, and this is where people either get confused or annoyed with the exposure triangle. So just think of it as a way to show that these three settings have an effect on each other when changed. To show you this relation, get your camera out and put it in manual mode with the following settings. Depending on the weather, on a sunny day, set it to 1/200th of a second, f16 and ISO 200. On a cloudy day, set it to 1/200th, f11, ISO 200. If it's overcast, 1/200th, f5.6 to f8 and ISO 200. And for a sunset, 1/200th, f4 and ISO 200. These settings should give you a good exposure, and if not, you might have to tweak a setting slightly up or down, but they should be close. Now, if you change just one setting, your exposure will either get darker or brighter. So to keep that initial exposure, let's say you slow your shutter speed down from 1/200th of a second to 1/100th of a second, you're doubling the amount of light you let into your camera. So you'd have to half the size of the aperture or half the amplification from the sensor, or split the difference between these two other settings, keeping the balance between all three the same, giving you the same initial exposure. I'm at a sunny location, so starting with 1/200th of a second f16 ISO 200, when I slow the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second, I'd have to close my aperture down to f22, which halves the amount of light. Or I'd have to drop the ISO to 100, which in the vernacular halves the sensitivity of the sensor. Also, with the 1/3 increments between stops in each of these settings, you could split it up. So I could change it to 1/100th of a second, f18 and ISO 125, or 1/100th of a second, f20 and ISO 160. These would all give you the same exposure. And the same applies if you sped up the shutter speed, change the aperture at all, or the ISO. You'd have to change the other two settings to compensate. So as you can see, the exposure triangle is a simple image to show you this relationship between your principal settings. And that's all it is. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, if you want to learn more about photography, watch this video next. And if you want to learn about flash photography, click down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography. I'll see you next time.